Hello and welcome to episode 209 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. I will once again be flying solo on the show today as I continue my once per month look at the tenure of former Disney chairman and CEO Michael Eisner. In December, we covered what may have been the biggest success of the Eisner era, the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The film showcased the attention to detail that would be associated with Eisner's leadership. It became a cultural phenomenon, and most importantly, the box office and merchandising profits went on to fund the Disney decade of the 1990s, also known as the Disney Renaissance. Today, however, we will focus on what may have been Eisner's biggest blunder. On its initial opening, Euro Disney, now known as Disneyland Paris, was a financial disaster for the company. While not the only reason for the scrap plans, the monetary strain it put on the company would play a part in canceled projects like Disney's America theme park in Northern Virginia, Westcott in Anaheim, and much more. To make matters worse, a lot of these issues can be linked directly to decisions made by Eisner himself. While Michael Eisner gets a lot of praise for his leadership at Disney, and a lot of it is rightfully earned, there were times when his ambitions got the best of him. Before we get started, I wanted to thank everyone who was a part of our big fundraising event on Saturday, January 18th. The video is still up from that night where I spent hours showing you the process of us recording future episodes of the podcast. This was all part of a fundraiser for the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank that was started by Diz Twitter's Jeff Gordon. We piggybacked on Jeff's fundraiser to try to help those impacted by the wildfires in Southern California. This is going to be a disaster that will put a lot of stress on the city for years and even decades. The people hit hardest by this will be the working class and middle class people of Los Angeles. Rent prices are expected to skyrocket. Thousands of people had their fire insurance policies rescinded just months before the fires. If we can, at the very least, help provide food to the community, that is a start. Jeff's fundraiser has ended. He was able to raise over $9,000 for the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank, which means they will be able to provide 27,000 meals with that money. But you can always donate by heading straight to the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank's website. This episode also marks the 4-year anniversary of the podcast. 4 years ago this week, we launched the first episode of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. I talked a lot more in depth about this in November for our 200th episode, but I still wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you. To think that we went from a podcast getting about 30 to 40 listeners per episode to what we are today is astounding. Just the fact that we have been able to raise money for food banks, LGBTQ plus organizations, domestic violence charities, and more is due to the support we receive from all of you. Do me a favor and make sure you are subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. If you are subscribed, tell a few friends to subscribe. If you listen on other platforms like Spotify, give us a 5-star rating. It all helps us get more exposure, and the more exposure we get, the better guests we can get on the show, the more access we get, and of course, the more we get to share our message of inclusion and positivity in the theme park community. While this episode is going to focus a lot on Michael Eisner, the idea for a European Disney park was being kicked around even before Walt's death. In 1966, the company started looking at locations on the other side of the Atlantic to build on the 11 years of success it had gotten from Disneyland in Anaheim. Walt was already distracted by the Florida project, which would eventually become Walt Disney World, and a potential ski resort that would never come to fruition. Before Walt's passing in December, sites were being considered in Frankfurt, Paris, London, and Milan. Obviously, those initial plans couldn't survive the shock of losing Walt in 1966 and Roy in 1971, just 2 months after the opening of Walt Disney World. No plans are ever completely scrapped at Disney, however. It took some help from a completely different part of the world for Europe to find itself again a part of expansion talks. Tokyo Disneyland opened to the public on April 15th of 1983. Expansion to Asia was made a lot easier by the Oriental Land Company. In February of 1974, after seeing the success of the newly opened Walt Disney World in Florida, the OLC contacted Disney executives to invite them on a fact-finding tour to explore the potential of a Disney park that was not owned by Disney. Imagineering would still work on the layout, attractions, and Disney would provide the intellectual property, but the financial burden would be shared with the Oriental Land Company. Much like the concept for a European expansion, ideas for a Japanese park had also been on the table for decades before the idea would materialize. Businessman Kenizo Matsuo approached Walt Disney himself about the concept of a joint venture to bring the happiest place on earth to the land of the rising sun way back in the late 1950s. That was less than 5 years into the original Disneyland park. When Walt eventually dismissed the idea, Matsuo went ahead with a park that greatly borrowed from the Disneyland concept, but didn't feature any Disney intellectual property. Nara Dreamland was fairly successful for a stretch, operating from 1961 to 2006. Masatomo Takahashi was president of the Oriental Land Company in 1979 when the contracts were signed to build Tokyo Disneyland. The company immediately sent engineers and architects to Disneyland to familiarize themselves with the expectations guests had for a Disney park. Construction began on Tokyo Disneyland in 1980 with an expected budget of 100 billion yen, but like almost all Disney projects, it went over budget, costing 180 billion yen. This is where the partnership with the Oriental Land Company was critical. A year after opening Epcot at Walt Disney World, incredibly over budget, to have another park almost double the estimated price tag would have been a nightmare for the company. Sharing that financial burden helped to avoid some of the pitfalls Eisner would have a decade later in France. Michael Eisner, along with President and COO Frank Wells, took over the Walt Disney Company in September of 1984, and that's when the first moves were made to revisit a European destination. Tokyo Disneyland had welcomed over 10 million guests that first year and served as proof of concept for international expansion. Dick Nunes and Jim Cora were in charge of the parks division at the time, and they cast a wide net. The two presented a list of around 1,200 potential spots. Initially, Britain, France, Italy, and Spain were considered, but it became obvious relatively early in the process that the land in Britain and Italy just wasn't flat enough to accommodate a park layout like Anaheim, Orlando, or Tokyo. The list then narrowed to France and Spain by March of 1985, and the two nations were both excited by the possibility of all the potential economic benefits that could come from such a huge vacation destination. Finally, the list had been cut further to 2 potential spots in France and 2 potential spots in Spain. If you're interested enough in the Disney theme parks to be listening to a podcast about Euro Disney, I'm guessing that you already know some of the backlash that Disney, Eisner, and the park would receive from a lot of locals. When looking at that, it's important to remember that the Spanish and French governments didn't seem to have any reservations about the developments. Eisner absolutely will make some decisions from this point forward that are head-scratchers, but he was not the only person who plowed ahead through all of the signs of potential danger. The two Spanish sites that were still in the running in 1985 were both near the Mediterranean. This would have placed the new park in a similar climate to its counterparts in the United States. Disney was cognizant of the climate issue because the company asked for each potential site to provide average temperatures dating back 4 entire decades. The leading contender in these early stages was Pago, Spain, located right on the Mediterranean and just south of Valencia. Pago has had an interesting history. The Moriscos, or Moors who converted to Christianity, were driven out of the area in 1609, and it remained relatively empty until almost 2 centuries later when the wetlands in the area began to be developed. The unique landscape made Pago the perfect location for growing rice. The wetlands were also a barrier to Disney building there. These areas were not only beautiful, but they were home for the almost extinct Samarac, or Valencia tooth carp. Local environmental groups protested this possibility. I just want to take a quick moment to state that I am doing my best with some of these pronunciations. If they are incorrect, I apologize for any insensitivity. Another location that could have hosted the resort was Toulon, France. Also sitting along the Mediterranean, Toulon would have checked off a lot of boxes. The climate was perfect for a theme park. The town itself had a long and interesting history. Having a major vacation destination in this part of southern France would have potentially drawn more focus to all that Toulon had to offer. Americans in particular are often criticized for flying into Paris but never seeing other parts of France. So the possibility certainly existed that a Euro Disney put in Toulon would have had the potential to draw more American tourism money and other foreign tourism money away from Paris and into other parts of the country. In reality, these other destinations never really stood a shot. Michael Eisner had spent time after college as a playwright in Paris. According to the book Disney War by James R. Stewart, Eisner viewed Paris as the, quote, pinnacle of Western civilization, making the case that Paris wasn't much colder than Tokyo in the winter and that guests there were more than willing to queue up for attractions in frigid weather, and that Paris is one of the most visited cities in the world, with an established supply of tourists to pluck for a few days of Mickey pretzels and rides on Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. Eisner pushed for the answer he had wanted from the start. Dick Nunes tried to push back against his boss. In his opinion, the Spanish government seemed more than eager to work with Disney, and the climate could not be overstated. In December of 1985, a little over a year into his stint as chairman and CEO of the Walt Disney Company, Michael Eisner was in Paris to announce the plans for Euro Disney. In true Eisner fashion, his pitch was grandiose and probably unrealistic. He talked about a resort that would rival Walt Disney World in Florida. Thousands of hotel rooms, camping, golf, theme parks, a convention center, offices, and even residential properties. That trip was also when he signed the initial letter of agreement with the French government to build on a plot of land just shy of 5,000 acres. The final contract for the construction of Euro Disney was signed on March 24th of 1987. Construction on Euro Disney started in 1988. Eisner and his team leaned into American theming in almost all aspects of the project, starting with the hotels. When the park opened in 1992, there were 7 Disney hotels, providing 5,200 rooms, and all of the hotels were themed on different regions of the United States, including the Disneyland Hotel, Disney Newport Bay Club, Disney Sequoia Lodge, Disney Davy Crockett Ranch, Disney Hotel Cheyenne, and the Disney Hotel Santa Fe. In the years following, many of these hotels were given overlays to feature some Disney-owned intellectual properties. Cars has been added to the Hotel Santa Fe, and Toy Story to the Hotel Cheyenne, for an example. In 2021, the Disney Hotel New York, The Art of Marvel, opened at is what now Disneyland Paris. The grounds would also feature Festival Disney, which was similar to Disney Springs at Walt Disney World or Downtown Disney at Disneyland in California. 40 restaurants were built on property originally. 11 of the restaurants were in hotels or at Festival Disney, while the park itself was set to house 29 restaurants. Disney knew that they couldn't outdo the French on French cuisine, so they decided to focus on food prepared in American styles. One of the few accommodations Disney did institute for French habits was to have 30% of all park dining seating, around 2,300 seats, be outdoors. Eating outdoors in good weather is very popular in Europe. Some slight modifications were made to the American recipes to be a little more palatable by European guests, but Disney still instituted its rule of no alcohol in a castle park. That last decision proved to be a real miscalculation. Disney took an entirely different approach when hiring cast members for Euro Disney than their previous two resorts. Instead of relying as heavily on seasonal and temporary part-time employees like they had at Disneyland in California and Walt Disney World, Euro Disney aimed to have full-time cast members filling an estimated 12,000 in-park positions. Communication was a major factor when considering potential CMs. A theme park on a continent with 24 official languages would need cast members who could assist guests from all over Europe and beyond. Bilingual candidates were targeted, with one of those languages needing to be French. The French government had an agreement with Disney that the local labor force would be favored when filling roles, but casting centers were also established in London and Amsterdam, in addition to the one in Paris. Euro Disney got its own branch of Disney University to train cast members, and 24,000 people had applied by November of 1991. In a previous episode of the podcast, we talked about Michael Eisner's miscalculation when it came to a theme park in Northern Virginia called Disney's America. Eisner ignored several warning signs and believed the local politicians who told him everything would be fine. Historians felt many of the topics Disney was planning on covering in the theme park were way too heavy and worried Disney wouldn't handle them in an appropriate way. Proximity to the Manassas battlefield was also a concern for those historians. Congress held hearings and Ralph Nader organized a protest before Disney's America was finally scrapped. Actually, the initial financial struggles at Euro Disney probably played a part in the park's cancellation as well. Michael Eisner ignored some very similar signs when moving forward with Euro Disney. French intellectuals called the plans cultural imperialism and worried it would promote an American-style culture of consumerism in France. Please remember my previous caveat when it came to pronunciations. Stage director Ariane Minochkine called the potential impact of a Disney theme park so close to Paris as a cultural Chernobyl. This phrase was used by almost every opponent of Euro Disney for years. French philosopher Michael Serres was a little more generous when he said, quote, "It is not America that is invading us. It is we who adore it, who adopt its fashions and above all, its words." The resistance wasn't confined to mere verbal attacks. On June 28th of 1992, French farmers conducted a blockade of Euro Disney to protest farm policies that were supported by the U.S. government. French labor unions were also quick to mount protests. Worker-friendly French laws allowed for certain amounts of protections that weren't found under U.S. law. For example, Disney's Code of Appearance specified the type of hairstyles cast members were allowed to have. forbid CMs from having visible tattoos or certain visible piercings, and didn't accommodate for facial hair. The unions called the provisions, quote, an attack on individual liberty. Disney, who had also gotten feedback for a policy of managers requiring meetings be conducted in English, defended the appearance codes as part of the image of the company. Thor Degelman was Euro Disney's personnel director and said, quote, for us, the appearance code has a great effect from a product identification standpoint. Without it, we couldn't be presenting the Disney product that people would be expecting. Still, no matter what roadblocks Disney faced, Michael Eisner pushed forward with his plans until finally it was time for the park to open to the general public. On April 12th of 1992, the opening day of Euro Disney Resort and Euro Disneyland Park, a government survey warned that 500,000 people would be driving 90,000 cars making their way to the complex. French radio warned against trying to fight the crowds to Euro Disney. These calculations were off on an immense scale. In the early afternoon, the parking lot was still only about half full. The disappointing opening day numbers were quickly brushed aside by Disney due to a workers' strike on the railway connecting Paris to Euro Disney. Excuses piled up for months, but the combination of bad press and an August recession in Europe, the resort was struggling. With a limited number of attractions in the park, Disney also overestimated the number of hotel rooms that would be needed in the beginning. Until Euro Disney experienced some expansions, added some attractions, and eventually built Walt Disney Studios Park, which opened in 2002, there just wasn't a need for all that lodging. Even with the recession lowering the number of available jobs throughout France, cast members were leaving at an astonishing rate. In May of 1992, a year after the park's opening date, The Hollywood Reporter estimated that about 3,000 cast members had left due to unacceptable working conditions. That was roughly 1/4 of the total workforce. Anyone who pays close attention to international news has probably seen videos of mass protests in France when government wants to implement austerity measures, cut down on vacation days, or anything else against the working class. Disney wanted to staff Euro Disney with full-time employees, but they didn't realize the level of professionalism and respect service jobs received in France. Students on the college program at Walt Disney World in Florida weren't taught to have those types of expectations for a job. Even if they did expect better treatment, a summer program with a set end date is a lot easier to stick with than a full-time job that is not providing you with what you expect. After the first year of operation, Euro Disney Company's stock was plummeting. The park was getting about half of the expected attendance. On July 23rd of 1992, park officials announced an expected loss of roughly 300 million French francs. The plans for Disney Studios were put on hold and prices at the hotels were reduced. They even made the decision to close the Newport Bay Club seasonally. In 1993, the brand new Indiana Jones roller coaster opened, but problems with the emergency brakes resulted in guest injuries within the first few weeks of operation. Admission price is only a small fraction of how a theme park makes its money. The original estimates expected each guest would spend about $33 US per day while inside the park. Whether due to the economy, the offerings, or just something culturally, Euro Disney wasn't coming close to that number. On June 12th of 1993, in an effort to increase attendance and in-park spending, alcohol was introduced for sit-down meals. While some of the measures Disney implemented did help, by the summer of 1994, Euro Disney was $3 billion in debt. The company was over-leveraged, but the banks didn't want to be saddled with a theme park resort on a vacant plot of land. Euro Disney management used the threat of abandoning the property to reduce the financial stake from 49% to 39%. The banks also allowed the company to forego interest payments until 1997. The financial implications of this catastrophic opening cannot be overstated. Earlier this episode, I mentioned the cancellation of Disney's America theme park in Northern Virginia. That decision was based on more than just finances, but money played a part. In Walt Disney World, fans of Disney's Animal Kingdom missed out on the proposed Beastly Kingdom Land, which would have featured animals from mythology and other fictional creatures. Before Disney California Adventure, the plan was to build an Epcot-style park across the Esplanade from the original Disneyland park called Westcott. In a few weeks, Sarah Says and I will actually be doing an episode about Westcott. That's another interesting story. The tides finally started to turn in 1994. In Europe, after the implementation of the euro currency, a name like Euro Disney sounded too much like a money grab to guests in the EU. In addition to the negative connotations surrounding euro as a financial term, the park needed a rebrand to try and detach from the negative image of the first few years. On October 1st, the resort changed its name to Disneyland Paris. The biggest reason for the turnaround, however, came on May 31st of 1995. Disneyland Paris opened its own version of Space Mountain. This Space Mountain was not like its counterparts in Anaheim, Orlando, or Tokyo. This attraction had a cannon launch system on the outside of the ride, inversions, and an on-ride soundtrack. Elton John, Claudia Schiffer, Buzz Aldrin, and other celebrities attended the opening ceremonies. Disneyland Paris recorded its first quarterly profit of $35.3 million in July of 1995. By November, it was revealed that attendance for the fiscal year grew from 8.8 million to almost 11 million. Hotel occupancy went from 60% to almost 70%. Things were moving in the right direction, and Michael Eisner had weathered the storm of his mistakes. Now, Disneyland Paris is a resort with two thriving theme parks. There are Frozen, Marvel, and Lion King expansions on the horizon. Disney has put on one-of-a-kind drone shows over Sleeping Beauty Castle. After attendance highs around 2010, the park is starting to get back to pre-pandemic numbers. It took a number of bad decisions to make a European theme park such a struggle, but the same stubbornness that caused the problem may have led the company out of the woods. I know that I've been promising a Michael Eisner episode every month, but we're looking at a very busy stretch on the podcast. We're going to take a quick break from talking about the former Disney chairman and CEO, but we will return to the topic in the summer. In the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about Muppet Vision 3D being replaced at Disney's Hollywood Studios. Sarah Says and I will talk about when Disney animatronics go wild. Maz and I will have a tier list of Walt Disney World pre-shows. I will talk to a representative from the ultra-accessible theme park in San Antonio called Morgan's Wonderland. And I will be chatting with the hosts of the Stride Sisters podcast. There is just so much to cover, and a lot of it is topical. 40-year-old stories about Michael Eisner can wait a few months. Do me a favor and take this moment to share the podcast with a friend. You listen to the entire thing. I'm sure they would like it as well. Make sure you're subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. Like and post positive comments on all of the videos, vlogs, and podcasts that you enjoy on the YouTube channel. In the past 10 days, we have all been through a lot. Freedom of expression is being attacked, and the only way to combat those who want to suppress creativity is to create. Whether it's a painting or a podcast, a novel or a meme, put your individuality out into the world. Weak men want us all to be the same. Show your individuality. Share your voice. Speak out for your friends who are in marginalized communities. Speak out for people you don't even like who are in marginalized communities. Most importantly, no matter what the men who use daddy's money to seize power say, you belong here and you are loved. If you are at your lowest and you don't feel like you have anywhere to turn, keep moving forward, even if it is just out of spite. I will be back next Thursday with another episode of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Until then, have a great week.